This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Beta. Our guest today, Marc Barasch. Marc is the author of several books. His most recent book, The Compassionate Life. He has also started the Green World campaign. He talks about spirituality. He talks about responsibility to the environment and how we combine these things. And we're very happy, Marc, you took the time to come on the show and talk with us today.
Delighted to be here. Phil and I go back a long way.
Marc, yes, and I want to go back to some of the work you did back in the early days of, early days to us. But I want to start with the present. I was in Utah at the Parliament of World Religions when you gave a very effective keynote about the work you're doing on the Green World campaign. So let's open with that. It's timely, and maybe you can tell our listeners what the Green World campaign is and how you came to get it off the ground.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to do that. So you mentioned I'd written a book called The Compassionate Life, which was about compassion, empathy, altruism, social healing, etc. And did okay. And but I felt that I wanted to do more than just kind of wave my arms around and point at compassion, even though it did kind of help spawn the Compassionate Cities movement, and I think had some impact as a set of ideas. But I felt we're in this era of global crisis. What can I do? And it was a very open question like that. I had always been an environmentalist, but I did a lot of other things, and it wasn't that I was necessarily looking in that direction. But I just sort of opened up my life after I got off book tour, and my mother had died right at that moment pretty much, and that affected me very deeply. I just wanted to, kind of honor her memory as somebody who I looked at as an altruism teacher, and I just stopped everything I was doing and thought, show me a way to help. And I happened to run into a guy who'd been planting trees around the world all his life. He was an agroforester, which I'd never heard of. So agroforestry is planting trees and crops together. So you're doing reforestation, you're doing landscape restoration, you're doing poverty alleviation, food security, climate change resilience, and at scale, climate change mitigation. And I thought, what's not to like about this? So I'm going to learn about this. And I did a little film about him, and I followed him to Ethiopia, and then I started working in Ethiopia, planting trees, and got hooked on this really rather audacious idea that we could together ReGreen the world in one generation and solve a lot of collective problems. And that regeneration was the successor meme and frame and construct and practice to sustainability, which is very critical, to be sustainable, but it's just not enough at this point when we have such a short timeline to fix the world, and that is not an exaggeration, maybe less than a generation by most scientific calculations now. And so to just sustain things as they are is really just dampening the perturbations of a system that has become dysfunctional. So we have to really sort of birth the emergence into a new system that's generative, regenerative, a compassionate civilization, and post-haste. And I started Green World campaign to really try to help to catalyze that process. And we've worked in 6 countries now and 3 continents and planted millions of trees, and are focusing our work in Kenya and most recently Nigeria.
Yeah, Marc, I wanted to ask you, the focus of our podcast is spirituality, and when these days when you hear anything about somebody being committed to the environment, I think amongst many of us it's assumed that there's a spiritual component to that. I grew up Catholic. I never remember any spiritual connection to taking care of the environment. The most I ever heard was don't litter on the school grounds or whatever. But there was no real connection there. And I think in our Judeo-Christian tradition, as I was, and we were born the same year, by the way, there wasn't much of that. But it seems that it was part of native religions and native people's belief systems. What is your feeling about the relationship of spirituality to our responsibility toward our environment?
Yeah, well, really the essence of spirituality, you might say, if you really sort of boil it down, it's mindfulness, awareness, consciousness, and, on one side, and compassion, right?
Hmm.
And compassion is care for all life, right? It's biophilia in E.O. Wilson's wonderful formulation. And I could read you a quote that Einstein is quite famous for in some circles anyway, that really, I think, sums it up. And he says, a human being is part of the whole, called by us the universe, but experiences himself and his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. And this delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few people nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to include all living things and the whole of nature in its beauty. Einstein was not particularly theistic, but I think he sums up a lot of the core principles. And yes, you do find that more explicitly in indigenous traditions, where even the body is coextensive with nature. So if the body is ill, the assumption is that it's actually coming from the natural environment that needs to be healed to, the community needs to be healed. It's a much more unitary and holistic view, very much, by the way, consonant, you mentioned Catholicism, with Pope Francis's wonderful encyclical Laudato Si, which is really the closest thing to what I've been calling green compassion these past 10 years, that it's people and planet and some sense of, spiritual openness and love, right? The principle of love has to be extended out in these widening circles that Einstein quote refers to. In Judaism, in the Old Testament, you do find Wordsworthian kind of odes to nature, and you have a deity that's really portrayed in many different ways in different sections. I mean, it's not just the sort of sometimes war god, or sometimes father god, or sometimes supreme being, as we like to say, but also a kind of a embedded in all things, right? It's that monotheistic tradition was a god who was by and large portrayed as formless and permeating the world. So looking at everything as sacred, everything as holy, I think naturally leads to a sense of reverence for nature. But I would say in the case of, for example, Catholicism, if you look at the history of the Church, early history of the Church, say especially the 3rd, 4th century, when it was, for example, being promulgated in what was then Gaul, now modern France, that there was a very concerted campaign to cut the connection to nature. So that any site that was considered a sacred site by the indigenous traditions, or a goddess site or the like, a church would be built there, and there would be a doctrine of intercession, that you could not deal directly with the spirits of nature. And in fact, from an early days of Christianity point of view, nature was evil. Nature was chaos. Nature was darkness. Nature was instincts and impulses, forbidden. It was animality. All these associations, the feminine, which was kind of degraded and downgraded. So there was a kind of conflation of a lot of, quotes, kind of satanic characteristics to nature, as well as to worship of nature, which was, quote, paganism. So it was an interesting kind of co-optation where you have, Our Lady of Notre Dame was a goddess site, and you find old pagan sites beneath these churches. So that connection was cut very early, and this kind of radical dualism, whether it's Cartesian mind-body split, or whether it's a split between humanity and the animal realm, or humanity and nature, it's gone on for a long time in Western civilization, certainly amplified by some of the narrower religious views. But I think if you, like all religious texts, you can cherry pick them to say whatever you want them to say. And I think when you really look through most of the great religious core texts, you find a lot of odes in reference to the natural world. So we're just basically having to regain something that we've lost, and that was part of the gist of the talk that Phil referred to that I gave at the Parliament of the World's Religions. In a workshop subsequently, I took note that a lot of the world religious traditions are really becoming very oriented towards eco-spirituality. I think it's the rising movement within all the religious traditions now, an extraordinary movement that's coming up spontaneously within each tradition. And as well, a lot of the religious traditions have been leaders in the carbon divestment movement, which you may be aware of, that there's been an enormous, very tangible movement to get rid of stocks that promote carbon going into the atmosphere. Now, this was a movement that people thought was going to be very small, and in fact, it's over $3 trillion. So one of the points that I tried to make is that the logical place for some of this money to be reinvested is in the kinds of projects that we and a lot of other people are doing around the world, which is regeneration of degraded soil. And communities that are living on anthropogenic savanna, as it's called, land that's been degraded by people. Because if we do that, we're absorbing a lot of carbon. Healthy soil is full of microorganisms that absorb carbon.
Let me interrupt you for a second there, because I want to get into that, and I think Phil had a specific question in regard to that.
I want to get back to the question of spirituality and care for the environment. It would seem from what you said and the quote from Einstein that you would probably agree that there's an element of consciousness here, that people who sense a connection to a larger whole or something beyond themselves and have a sense of identity that doesn't just include themselves and their particular tribe, are more likely to be in sync with the need to protect and preserve the natural environment. I'm sure you would agree that, therefore, that spiritual practices come into play. And I'd love your response to that in light of the fact that a lot of the leaders in the environmental movement would not even think of themselves as spiritual, but are sort of secular and scientific and and are going, sort of by data and analysis, and which brings up the question: are they sort of, in a sort of closet sense, spiritual in their own way? So I'd be curious what you've noticed in this regard.
Yeah, these are all incredibly important points. And I mean, I'll say that I started the Green World campaign as kind of an experiment, and the experiment was how to bring, personally my own spiritual perspective into a pragmatic domain, environmentalism, where I didn't see it except in, the early days of the Green Party in Germany, for example. You saw a lot of kind of neo-pagan spirituality that was nature worshipping and that sort of thing. But fundamentally, I think that the environmental movement has been characterized a lot by political, strategic, tactical thinking, and a lot of oppositional politics, right? That Greenpeace, which has done such amazing work and made, such strides towards compelling corporations to behave better, they've done it through, embarrassing them. I mean, it's not Griaha, it's been definitely, nonviolent confrontation, but there's a kind of sense of good guys and bad guys, and I'm not naive about that. I think there are bad actors in this world that are, ruining things for everybody else. But I think the spiritual point of view is, kind of a little more embracing, a little more like, the self is other. And this idea of identity that you mentioned, of course, I think that is one of the constructs that all, certainly inner traditions, chip away at and sometimes blast apart, because it's seen as an obstacle to agape and Rahmamin and Judaic terms, or Hesed, or universal compassion. We have kind of our altruism towards those who we perceive as like us and the things we identify with, and then the stuff beyond that pale we don't care so much about or treat as other. So getting beyond this kind of self and other dichotomy seems to be a key to me to effective environmental action. I think that if we don't create a movement, and I think it is emerging, and again, I think this eco-spiritual movement is a great example, that if we don't create a movement that isn't motivated by the power of love, this force that Teilhard de Chardin said was a radical energy that would be like discovering fire for the second time if we could really implement it. That is going to be the key to getting through this evolutionary bottleneck that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, Mark, your main organization, as I understand it, is it's found at greenworld.org. How were you structured? You have a lot going on. You have a lot of different divisions under that umbrella. And how do you fund yourself?
Well, okay, those are the. I wish they were $1 million questions. It's really, as I said, it started as an experiment. So this was a personal gesture that I wanted to make. I just kind of, arbitrarily named it something that seemed like it would be clear in terms of what its intent was, and put the flag up, and I built it as a collaboratory. Like, people could come in and work on it as they would in whatever way they wanted, whatever intensity, given whatever their interests and skills were. And it was an experiment in emergence, in a way. Like, what would happen if, I, as one person, did the experiment Bucky Fuller did. Bucky Fuller called himself Guinea Pig B for Bucky, and he had actually been near suicide at one point in his life, and he saved himself by saying, well, I wonder what one person can do for the good in the world if they really devote themselves to it. So it was sort of that idea. And it has been an absolutely amazing journey to find, and I'm sure you've discovered this, and many of the listeners have, that when you tune into this, when you begin to act in this way, you say, I'm going to live a compassionate life to the best of my ability and in every dimension that I can, that things start to happen. There are synchronicities, and you run into people, and helping hands appear. So it's been a completely organic journey of just let me see where things guide me, and that would seem like it would be very ineffectual, not very well organized. But in fact, it's shown me that there is indeed a self-organizing principle in the world that can steer us if we allow it to. And that's not to say it's been passive. It's been a lot of incredibly hard work and a certain amount of stress and around the clock to keep something like this going. I've probably raised close to $1 million for it over 10 years, and that has been, I don't want to say hook or by crook, because crook is not the word I want to use. It's been very, very transparent, uber transparent, and much more than actually most organizations. And we're mostly volunteers. I mean, I have essentially not paid myself and gotten by as I can. I mean, that's just been part of the practice. That goes for everybody else that's worked on it. There are no big salaries. There's no building. And yet I found that we have been remarkably effective. We've planted 1 million trees in Kenya. We have 100 schools that are teaching basically eco-education. We're working with elders who are restoring sacred kaya forests.
Mark, if a school, somebody's listening, they say, oh, how do we get that in our school? Is there a curriculum you can provide teachers?
It's really essentially the kids grow trees in seedbed nurseries and take care of those trees for 3 years, and also bring the trees into their communities. So it's a way that we've introduced new multi-use species to probably 50,000 farmers in Kenya. And we are looking for sister school programs. We actually had one with the Punahou School briefly, Obama's alma mater in Hawaii, but we would like to create an international Green World Schools movement so that kids could take part in this idea of regreening the world in one generation, and to be able to reach out to and learn about and help support these impoverished communities that we're now working with in Kenya, mostly along the coast near Mombasa, so that they can do this amazingly effective work, which has actually included a youth-led Trees for Peace movement that became a national movement in Kenya and averted election violence in the last national elections, and involved probably 11 different groups when we were finished with it. We've done a lot of leveraging with collaboratories again, and since that's really our practice and our ethos, and it's extraordinary, again, how far you can get by simply being a catalyst. But as far as funding, if there's anyone out there that wants to help, it's very difficult. We just got a small grant from Lush Cosmetics. We've gotten small grants from Disney Worldwide Conservation Fund and White Wave and a few other companies. But fundamentally, it's been $5 and $10, $20, and $40 donations coming in over the grant.
Well, we'll appeal to our listeners, and I'm sure you're facing a strange world where there's a lot of different organizations doing good work for the environment, and you're all competing for the same donations and the same donors. Let me switch gears for a minute, Mark, because you have a long-term perspective. I'd like to hear your take on a couple of things. You were the editor of New Age Journal back in probably was it the 70s or 80s?
Early 80s?
Yeah, and at the time, this was sort of the peak of what people would now call historically the New Age movement, and when a lot of ideas that are now commonplace in the culture and mainstream, like yoga and meditation and so forth, were new and weird, and the New Age Journal was a leading voice for those things. At the same time, New Age became a kind of a term of derision for flakiness and weirdness and so forth. What was your experience, and what do you think of it in retrospect? And are both true?
Yes, all of the above. It was not easy. I think a lot of us, that go back that far, we were the oddballs, right? We saw the world a certain way almost congenitally, and looked for other people who saw it that way, partly to assure ourselves we weren't nuts. I mean, I always saw the world this way since the earliest I can remember. I'm sure, a lot of people would relate to that, I had spiritual impulses. I saw things as connected. I felt there was a metaphysical realm. I was very interested in preserving nature. I started studying yoga in my teens when nobody was really doing it, and I had to find a book. As we remember, there were very few teachers around then. I had been fortunate in that I'd run into a very good Tibetan Buddhist teacher, so by the time I got to New Age Journal, I was pretty dyed-in-the-wool, meditation practitioner, and I actually brought that perspective to New Age Journal as well as wanting to mainstream the ideas. I felt that these were not woo-woo ideas. I felt these were the seeds of the emerging civilization that was the way that we were going to have to go if we were going to survive together on this planet. And I think that's certainly become more evident over time. So to me, these were really mainstream ideas in an embryonic phase, and of course it wasn't embryonic for other cultures which had these ideas deeply embedded, and it kept them alive for millennia. But we had gotten very far away from it in industrial civilization, and as we organized it. So trying to put them forward, it meant a lot of derision from journalist friends who I had to cajole into writing for the magazine. But it's funny. I was just thinking the other day of Kevin Kelly, who had been one of the writers I inherited, in a sense, when I first took over the magazine. And he was a good writer. He's a spiritual guy who had just done a pilgrimage from Mount Athos to the Ganges, and I had just started hearing about this strange thing called computer networking in 1983, and I thought, I don't want a technology guy to go and look at this. I want a spiritual person to go look at it. So I had Kevin go out, and he spent 8 months, and he came back, and he said, something is really going on. We had this cover story called Network Nation, and then Stuart Brand saw that article and made Kevin editor of Whole Earth Review, and then Kevin became editor of Wired. I can give you a lot of instances like that where I can remember having cover stories where, can business behave ethically? I mean, that was like an open question then. And I had a picture of a guy with a glowing briefcase, in front of an office building. It just seemed like a very heterodox idea that there could be something like ethical investment, but that was just starting out. And now, you look at things like Calvert and Dominy and the impact investment movement, it's billions upon billions of dollars being repurposed through business into trying to make create a style and a content of business that actually does good in the world. Yoga obviously has become as ubiquitous as gym used to be, and more. And you could argue, of course, that and people have that and the mindfulness movement, which are extraordinary advances in being taught in corporations now en masse, and have tremendous value, at the same time maybe are losing some of the original sense of this not being just purely instrumental, that we don't do yoga just to develop a yoga body for the beach, and we don't do meditation just to become more sort of efficient because we're more mindful. So I have to say that, as virtually every trend that New Age Journal was widely mocked for putting forward into public discourse became, very much a mainstream idea. There has also been a kind of, I think, a leakage in a way into, American consumerism and into utilitarian, instrumental usages for something that was intended to be free and freeing. Right, like if you're coming from a Buddhist tradition, or I think a Hindu tradition too, the idea is moksha or enlightenment or liberation. Right, that you are liberating yourself from, Buddhist terms, grasping and aversion and ignorance, meaning ignoring, denial. Right, the three poisons as they're known, and that this is what leads to enlightenment and compassion and self sort of transformation for the sake of others. And one would hope that kernel of purpose, could remain as these techniques and practices and viewpoints become so much embedded in, a society that's still governed by mainstream capitalism and military-industrial complexes and medical-industrial complexes.
But Mark,
your tenure at New Age Journal is responsible for the word natural being on every food product that no matter how unnatural.
Well, I don't want to take the blame for that. I did my best. I did actually edit Natural Health magazine after that, so yeah, I really did.
They never explain what they mean by natural. Mark, at this point in your life and in your endeavors, are you optimistic or pessimistic for the future?
Yeah, totally optimistic for no good reason. I mean, really, we're in a mess. It's we don't even need to talk about the current presidential race, but it's being mirrored everywhere, really. But I think this is always the darkness before the dawn. I mean, I'm kind of a congenital optimist, and I do think that. These are this is two steps. It's one step back to go two steps forward. That this always happens when the world is about to go through kind of a phase shift. Or in Eli Prigogine's terms, we used to reference him a lot in New Age Journal, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist who talked about dissipative structures, and he said that when the existing structure begins to undergo perturbation, it can't handle the energy input that it's receiving. It seems to be going into chaos chaos and decay, but actually what that is a reorganization until a new structure emerges from that is able to handle this new input of energy. I think that's really what we're going through. I mean, it's very clear to me what the outlines of a new civilization are, and I think to anybody that's really, not just reading the headlines, because, you look at the headlines are always the footnotes of history. Right, and the footnotes are really the future headlines. So a lot of what we're doing, it might be footnoted right now, but I think that the trend line is very clear that we are collectively creating an interconnected global civilization that is increasingly prizing the values of compassion and empathy and mindfulness and trying to get beyond kind of tokenism of greenwashing and that sort of thing, and actually say, as we are starting to say with one of our projects, what does a regenerative industry look like? How can a company do something at scale that by its operations is regenerative, not just as an afterthought through a corporate social responsibility office?
If your optimism is to bear fruit in the future, it will be not our generation of elders and the fast becoming elders of the boomer generation, but the young people who are now in their 20s and 30s, you presumably, given your work, have some exposure to that generation. What do you notice? What do you observe? And are you feeling good about them?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, these are really the people of the future. I mean, the millennials are a big problem for some of these corporations, for example, because they have realized they're not going to work for a company that they don't feel is doing some good. They all want to do social ventures, or they want to do philanthropy, or I mean, all of them. That's a huge exaggeration, but there's a sizable cohort, let's say, and they're being educated. I don't mean to focus on business, but lately I've just been looking at that as a potential force for change that it is. And if you look at Wharton and Berkeley out here, there's the Haas School of Business and Harvard School of Business. They're all taking a lot of the human potential movement ideas, and where they have been used in sort of corporate practices to make corporations function better. But now they're going further and saying, well, what should a company do in the world? And these millennials are really putting a lot of pressure on the companies to step up, because they can't get in technical terms, retention of their top employees, their good employees, in that generation, if they don't show a sense of social purpose and environmental progressivism. I think that's really a clear trend line. So I think that these kids have been raised on the ideas that, we elders, if you will, had to fight pretty hard to get through the flack of the previous civilization, if you want to look at it that way, and have had the benefit of starting on a higher floor of the building. So they, of course, take for granted a lot of assumptions that we had to, sort of punch through a lot of walls to let in the light. And again, this isn't universal. Anything I'm saying, very easily you couldn't say there's a counter trend and there's a counter argument, and I would never deny that. I just think that, again, when you look at the asymptote of things, it seems clear to me that there's a directionality, and it's a progressive directionality, and progressive not just sort of politically, but spiritually, and in a way post-politically. We're in this last gasp of the battle of the dinosaurs in so many countries, right? Horrific things being done that are really consonant with a very the most unenlightened worldview imaginable. But I think I like to see it, let's say, as a last dying gasp, and that the dinosaur's tail is thrashing in its final throes, and at the same, the mammals are emerging,
Right.
And because really, when I did this book on compassion, and I thought about Darwinian selection, and what was really left out of a lot of subsequent conversations is Darwin also talked about group selection. Not just the individual, the selfish gene, as Dawkins calls it, but the idea that the group is the unit of survival, right? And if the group is to survive, he pointed out that it needs a certain number of altruistic members. I think that now we're in an era the ethologist Franz de Waal calls the survival of the kindest. That if we're going to get through this, we're going to, it's almost a Darwinian pressure to become a collectively more empathic and compassionate and conscious collective group called humanity. Humanity is the unit of survival now. The biosphere is the unit of survival, and so there is some precedent for collectives sort of self-organizing toward their own survival, and I think that is what we're facing.
Mark,
it's no joke.
Yeah. I want to thank you for your optimism, because certainly there's a lot of other directions we can look in. But I think you're right. I mean, I think the trend is upward in a good direction, although there's evidence that it's not always going in that direction. Thank you so much for your time, Phil. Any final points you'd like to make?
No, I'd just like Mark to first of all to thank Mark for his time and ask him to give our listeners a website or anything where they can find out more about what he's up to.
Oh, great, thanks. Yeah, so it's www.greenworld.org. greenworld.org, and please get in touch with me if you're interested. And The Compassionate Life and some other books I've written can be found on Amazon. Some of them actual books. Compassionate Life is still in print, or others now in ebook form. And we'll be announcing some things over the next year. I hope that will be very impactful in terms of some of the work we're doing at scale in places like Nigeria, and again trying to do our part for building this regenerative civilization.
Thanks, Mark.
Great. Thank you so very much. And all of that information about the website and whatnot will be posted up on our website, www.spiritmatterstalk.com. And any other information you would like to communicate us, our listeners out there, please do so. We always enjoy hearing from you. Mark, thank you once again.
Thank you guys very much.